Hey everybody, welcome to our panel, our 4 p.m. panel discussing art and gender. Unfortunately, Dr. Roman Kräussl was unable to make it at the last minute, so in a moment we're going to welcome to the stage moderator Mike Walsh from Structure Capital, a Bay Area VC fund focused on the zero waste economy. He will be in conversation with Carrie Scott of Carrie Scott and Partners, and Gemma Rolls-Bentley, private sales lead at Artsy, curator of the Gay Times, and also of the installation Queertopia here at If So What. So please welcome to the stage our panelists.
Hello, thank you for being here. I'm not Dr. Roman, as you can tell if you've looked at the website. But I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I'm a venture capitalist, so I'm not even in the art world, though I do love art, and I've got a bunch of originals at my house, so I was kind of thrilled to be here. And this particular panel is interesting to me because there's a huge problem that exists in the venture capital industry, in the gender divide, but I had no idea it was prevalent in the art industry. So I'm really glad, well, I'm sorry about that, first of all, but I'm glad Gemma and Carrie are here to talk about this because they're familiar with it. So I guess, can we get a little bit more to start on your backgrounds?
Yeah, like some context. Sure. So I'm Gemma Rolls-Bentley. As the MC said, I work at Artsy, leading the private sales business, and I do some curating as well. But I have considered gender within my professional space and creative practice for as long as I can remember. I guess being female, I'm impacted directly by the the gender ratio that we see across the industry. And my the kind of main reason, I guess, that I'm here to speak on the topic is in 2012, I led a campaign in the UK called the Art Audit, which was on behalf of the Fawcett Society, the UK's leading feminist network. And we reviewed the galleries and museums and public commissions in London across 1 year and produced a study looking at the gender ratio. And that study, it remains the kind of most comprehensive study, even though it wasn't particularly comprehensive and it really only looked at London. But nothing on that scale has been done since, so it often gets referred back to in terms of numbers. But I could go into lots of detail about the data, but the main thing to say is that roughly 25 to 33% is what we saw in terms of female representation and that was both in the commercial space, so looking at gallery rosters and the artists represented, but also looking at public sector, looking at museum shows, looking at commissions. And even we included some things like the front covers of Art Review magazine, like which artists were included. So that was kind of the main thing. And then in my curatorial practice, I look a lot at queer artists, female artists. Those are the kind of people that I've been working with. And so, I can share anecdotal things around that too.
And Carrie, could you give us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I come at this probably from a slightly more personal approach. I'm a woman who works in the art world. I have done for about 20 years. And I have my own gallery now. I'm a curator and an art historian. And as a kid, I was always most interested really in the portrayal of women in imagery. And I think that my sort of broader view on the topic is actually how are women represented in art, not only visually and aesthetically, but also how are we represented as leaders, as artists, and as people. And I definitely have more questions on this subject than I have answers. And I have some frightening stats that I've written down in various guises that I sort of pulled together off my own Instagram, because it sounds like it seems as though I do every once in a while pop up and say, this is completely ridiculous. Why is there 2% of the art market looking at women? So, yeah, that's sort of my background.
Okay. And I think I didn't really mention too much about what I do for a living, but we invest in early stage startups. So we're among the first investors in Uber and in 140 other companies. And we focus on underutilized assets. So all the marketplaces here, the art marketplaces that have been discussed, are things that we would have invested in or at least looked at. But the fund isn't that old, frankly. But one thing that is so apparent in the venture industry is for the money in venture, about 4 or 5% of it goes to female-founded companies. We happen to be investors in, or 30% of our portfolio founders are females. And that's not really intentional, frankly. It's just that we look at amazing companies. So the stats that really, as I was reviewing some of the work that you've done, Gemma, and Roman's work and other works, one of the things that really interested me or surprised me is that 50% of graduates are females. And that's not the case in engineering school, so you can kind of understand that a little bit more, where engineers start a lot of companies. And then I think in your report I read, or you mentioned that 25% of MFAs are women. So why the huge discrepancy?
And it's interesting as well because actually earlier on in that educational journey, the ratio is even more skewed. So I think actually in the UK, looking at undergraduate level, certainly last time I checked, it was around 66% female, which is a big leap to then look at gallery representation and see something around 30%. And when we released the ELF art audit stats, we looked at the data, and we looked very much at the kind of educational space and then how those numbers compared to later in an artist or potential artist's life cycle. And we tried to understand better what caused that drop-off. And we hosted, again, we didn't have the answers. I still don't have the answers. But we hosted a series of events at the time where we invited different artists and art professionals to speak about their own experiences, just to try and get a better understanding of what those challenges are that are being faced by women typically rather than men. And it was really interesting to hear people speak. You know, we had people coming and speaking who had children, people who'd been single parents, and the tendency, I think, is to talk about children being the main reason. But listening to these mothers talk, their own experiences had been much more about the impenetrability of the art space. And they'd been at university, they'd felt pretty like on an equal footing, but then beyond that, they had really experienced a boys' network in the art space, and it definitely felt like when the opportunities were being handed out, the women that we had been speaking with hadn't necessarily felt that they were as accessible to them, or they hadn't been offered to them. So that was definitely something that was coming up. And I think as well, it's interesting when we talk about all of this data and all of these statistics, and I'm conscious of myself doing it too, we're thinking, when we did that study back then, we were thinking in pretty binary terms, thinking about male and female artists, and we weren't really talking about gender non-conforming artists, and I think that's a whole space as well that it's really important to think about and to consider, and very often in these studies doesn't even get there is often not even a category for someone who doesn't identify as female or doesn't identify as male. So I think that's kind of just something to keep in mind as well when we're thinking about all of those data sets.
Just because you said data, I'm going to go with data. I pulled out just 4 stats that I thought really bring this topic some color, right? So the first being there are no women in the top 0.3% of the auction market, and that's where 41% of the profit is concentrated. That's no women. That's crazy. Overall, 96.1% of art sold at auction is male-based. Work by women artists makes up only 3 to 5% of permanent collections in the US. It's slightly better in Europe, but not by much. And then the top 3 auction houses in the UK pay between 22% and 37% less than men pay women less. So I read those last night and was like, why, right? Why is that happening? Is it because we all disappear and have babies? And is that really knocking us out of the market? That doesn't seem right. And we talked about this a little bit upstairs. But I think back to the 1980s and the Guerrilla Girls movement, which was a text-based art project, for lack of a better word, that really asked all these questions, like, do women have to be naked to get into museums? Do we have to have a month dedicated to women to have representation? And did all the stats, which are like eerily similar. And I was 4 at the time. Like, how are we still here? And like I said, I've got way more questions than I have answers. But I think what we can't do is, one, sit here and point fingers at men, because we're all in this society together and we all need to do something about it. So you're off the hook, Mike. But also, I think we have to ask about how women are represented. So I work really closely with fashion photographers and fashion photography. And a couple years ago, I just literally looked at the 2013 fall campaign pictures, and again asked myself, why on earth are people buying into fashion images that still perpetuate this idea of a to-be-looked-at female? And how is the fashion industry still making billions off using those images to sell their products? So again, I'm just asking more questions, but I think it's all related. And I guess where things could start to change is as women come into positions of power that we say, actually, no, that's not okay. And that the men also say, that's not okay either. And that we come together to think about better ways to do all of it. And not just through opportunity, but by consumption, right? So not just giving people opportunities, but how we passively consume things.
I think as well, like thinking about the Guerrilla Girls, who are, probably still the most important people to have made themselves spokespeople in this way. And that's certainly what inspired the study that I led, was the way they had generated their statistics. But the Guerrilla Girls did an exhibition at Whitechapel Gallery in London last year where they revisited their statistics, and they were also asking the questions, why has nothing changed? Why are these numbers still really similar? And I think, thinking about the auction market and secondary market in general, that is bound to take longer to catch up. But I think it's really interesting thinking about what's happening in the primary space, and also thinking about what's happening in museums, and like you said, having female leaders in those spaces and having people in position of power and influence who really are taking that responsibility on in terms of resetting the balance where they can. Just to add some more data to that as well, obviously I said I work at Artsy, which is the world's leading marketplace online, and it's really interesting to look at the stats there. I had a look at the numbers for our artists, and we only have gender data for around roughly half of our artists that are on the platform. but of the 55,000 artists that we have gender data for, looking at the sales that have been made, it's less than 25% logged as female, which was, I thought was really interesting. And also thinking about gender identity as well. Artsy has a category for non-binary gender, and of those 55,000 artists, there's around 60 artists have been allocated with that. 60 of 55,000. And of course, that is the galleries or auction houses or whoever it is that Artsy's partnering with that that inputs that data. But I think what Artsy does in terms of looking at how to present the artworks and how to reframe and make art accessible, Artsy's editorial, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, it's the most read online art platform. The editorial really works hard to shine a light on the artists that have not necessarily had a platform. So there's a lot of writing around female artists, and when people are looking for art to buy, there will often be collections of work by different groups of artists. Artsy and the other online platforms, they provide a level playing field in a way. That data reflects real world art market, but I think what the online space can do is offer more of a level playing field and try and reset the balance somewhat. So I think that's kind of an exciting space and has a lot of opportunity, I would say.
Gemma, did you look at the average sale price rather?
Yeah. So the average sale price, the difference between male and female artists it's over $1,000 difference. And I mean, most of the sales that take place on the Artsy platform are under $100,000. The sales kind of happen anywhere in that space. There's probably a sweet spot around kind of $10,000 to $20,000. So to have that difference in sale price, it's big. It's not insignificant.
You're going to say something, Carrie?
Well, what I find even more confusing is that, if you look at the statistics for orchestras, they're doing blind auditions now where people come out behind screens and you can't tell what gender they are, and they audition, and now there's been a 40% increase in women in pit orchestras. And the same holds true for race. Gemma was saying when we were talking about this earlier. But with art, you're looking at the artwork. So the person's not present. And so often people don't know what, we know what Jeff Koons looks like because Jeff Koons is traded on his face. But if I asked you what Nick Knight looked like, you wouldn't know necessarily unless you're British. So that to me is an added complication of, it's about the artwork. It's not necessarily, and Mike, you were saying that you, as fate would have it, have mostly women in your collection.
Yeah, I never thought to look before this panel, but I just looked last night. I have, I think, 7 original pieces, and these are not expensive pieces, so that maybe is why this is. Like, the most expensive is maybe $20,000 or something, but most of them are much less expensive. And five of the pieces are by women. That excludes my son's artwork that's on the walls, but the
most important bits in the collection.
Exactly. It's confusing. So in the venture world, this has just kind of become a huge thing. Josh from TechCrunch was moderating the last panel, and he's probably written about this. But over the last 12 months, it's really become a big thing. So we're investors in something called Quilt, which is essentially a women's network. It's kind of shared co-working spaces for women only, and they're not fixed. There's something called the Wing in New York City, which we're not involved with, but those are fixed co-working spaces. The Quilt is more of any woman can host at her own house or studio or office or whatever the case is, and they have an hour's worth of speakers, essentially. But it's a great way for people to learn from one another. Another thing, so that's just a business that is trying to drive change. Something else that just was launched maybe 3 weeks ago, it was announced, but I knew about it a few months ago, is the percentage of partners in venture firms is actually really low too. I don't know the exact number. I brought on a female partner in my fund. There are only two of us. We've got a non-voting partner who happens to be a male, but a bunch of partners who are females started office hours for female founders. So I'm just wondering if you've heard of anything that's going on in the art world. I'd like to put you on the spot a little bit, and if you haven't, then you should start something, and I'm happy to help.
Yeah. I mean, I think the power of sisterhood is not to be underestimated. I mean, just speaking kind of from my own experience, I have a super strong network of people who have definitely been a real support for me through my own growth. I'm part of a coven. There are 13 women in the coven. There are 2 of us in the art world, but everyone else is in all different industries. And it's a really, we do things like, we do like some rituals around the moon, and we talk about like lots of different things, but we also do like peer mentoring. And, it's really great because the people that are in that group, it's people who are in finance sector, journalists. Everyone has got kind of different professional backgrounds, but there's always someone there that can offer some support. So if you're going into a pay negotiation and you'd like I think to have someone to coach you or give you some support, but also to feel like you have someone in your corner is super important. So I think there's a lot of value in that sort of self-organized spaces. But then I think there are some really there's some really great things happening in the UK. A couple of examples. One is the Max Mara Art Prize for Women that is hosted by the Whitechapel Gallery. And that's a prize, a biannual prize that awards one female artist a 6-month residency in Italy, funded by Max Mara, and then followed by an exhibition at the gallery. And it tends to be a kind of career-changing opportunity for artists. And the work that goes into that, it's offered exclusively for female artists to provide opportunity for growth. And they just announced the winner for this year a couple of weeks ago, and it's Helen Kamek, who is a person of color, a queer person of color in her 40s. And it was really interesting, to hear her speaking and saying she feels like this opportunity is going to totally change her career and her life. And so that kind of thing can be super influential. And then there's also, I think, some really amazing initiatives happening to look at disrupting or resetting balance in museum collections. So a good example is the Contemporary Art Society in the UK works closely with Valeria Napoleona. She's a collector who only collects female artists, and they've created a fund where they purchase one artwork every year for a different British institution. And so last year, it was a work by Martine Sims, and it was donated to the Leeds Art Gallery. And also they take those works outside of London, which is also great, because otherwise the art world can seem very kind of London-centric in the UK. So there's some really strong examples of things that are happening, definitely.
To echo that, and then controversially worry about it, there's a group called Marguerite that is exactly what Quilt sounds like. It's a group of women who they do really cool events at spaces across London, and it's all women based. But I sometimes worry about those things, and that there's this like ghettoisation of women in that then, that it's like, okay, well, no, we're doing the mainstream big boys game, just to use some really good verbiage, and you guys, you need to be off with Quilt. And the connotations of that are pretty, even for me, when I first read it in your email, I was like, oh, Quilt is a domestic space, so you've taken me out of business already? Or quilting was done in a domestic space. Now, I'm obviously reading too much into it, but actually there is a layer of that. There's an element of it. I'm not picking on you, I promise. But I think we have to be careful that, we don't just ghettoize ourselves. And, I have an amazing group of women who I talk to and lean on for sure. But I also try to make sure that I'm also playing in other spaces and other tables,
Yeah, it's actually a really good point. So when they first pitched me, I was like, I frankly love the idea of anybody launching a co-working space in their home at any point. I was like, why don't you let men do it too? Like, you're cutting out half the market if guys can't do it. Frankly, I think it's not a bad marketing tactic to start with women, and they'll probably add men later. But I completely agree with that.
I would hope it isn't just a marketing tactic as well. I'm sure there'll be value around that safe space that's being created, as well as kind of sharing learnings and opportunities and talking about challenges that are specific to non-male artists.
Yeah, agreed. And it's not for them at all. But for me, I like to double the size of the market. So though it's important, it's a great place to start. I hope that it's. I don't think that it would necessarily already be male only, because enough co-working spaces are already 95% men. But I hope that it's both at some point. And it's self-selective, so you could just hang with one group or the other. Another idea that I'm wondering if it's out there, and I haven't researched it, so I just don't know, is one of the approaches that when people don't have access in Silicon Valley, which usually means that they haven't had a success or two already, there are these tech incubators that have been incredibly successful, and it's just a way to get all this mentorship and expertise, and you've sort of got all the distribution channels and attorneys and legal and other successful entrepreneurs and mentors. So I just financed, on a personal level, I could get me in trouble just with my wife. She thinks it was a company funded thing, but
Facebook Live.
I know. I just financed a female artist of color just because I thought she was awesome and that she couldn't get this record made if I didn't help with this. But what it made me think about was there should be a music incubator like American Idol all the time, where you've got all these things, just like the resources that you need, similar to a tech incubator. So I'm kind of looking into that, exploring it with some other people that we would potentially build it and fund it and have someone run it. Does anything like that exist? I mean, that seems like something that should exist for the art world, especially when you start thinking about, and it's not necessary, I don't think it is, based on what I know about art, the creation of the art, but it's the distribution and representation and things like that.
I mean, I think as so far as an actual incubator, I don't know of one like that exists. I would argue, exactly like you said, if something like that were to be created, it wouldn't be about improving the quality of the art that was being made, because I think we have so many brilliant artists making work, but a space that would support artists in their growth and help them to navigate the art world and to have some savviness when it comes to the business and finding gallery representation or submitting successful arts council bids or whatever it might be. I think there is definitely room for support there for artists, and I think I've seen some really great examples of mentoring, which you mentioned, kind of filling that role. I mean, for myself, I have a bunch of young female and queer artists that I work with, where I will do some mentoring and just share some of my own knowledge being inside the art business. Because I think for all artists, it can be really difficult when you leave art school to know where to go, to know which galleries are going to look after you, which opportunities are the ones to take, to make sure you're not being exploited, because there are many, many young artists who do get exploited in the commercial art world. So I think to have some kind of mentoring support network, whether it's for artists or for professionals, female professionals, there are some good examples. As there's Marguerite that Carrie mentioned. There's also an Association of Women in the Arts is another organisation, AWOD, Association of Women Art Dealers. You know, I can think of many, many examples that are networks that facilitate mentoring, and some of them will actually offer some quite structured mentoring. So they might pair you, once you become a member, then they'll pair you with someone who's maybe got 10 years on you professionally who can support you through. And I think art schools as well are getting better at taking their alumni and helping the current students engage. And I shouldn't keep saying younger because it's not always about age, definitely not always about age. But helping the current students to engage with the alumni who may have gone on to have great success and can share some learning. So, yeah, mentoring, I think, is a super strong thing, and there's some great examples of it, and could probably be a lot more of that, too.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the art market is like the wild, wild west still. You know, it's unregulated. We don't have think tanks, for sure, there isn't a built-in network or a regulatory body that is saying this is how we do things and this is how we're supposed to do them. I mean, curatorially, it really is the Wild West. We're making it up as we go, and so I think that actually that could be a space that would really help improve statistics. Is that if we all got together and said, you know what, here's what we're driving towards. Let's work backwards. You know, as you do with any business goal, right? You know where you want to get and how do we get there? But I think unless we all sat down and said, actually, let's do this. You know, we're all in the arts because we're a bit creative and crazy and no one likes a business plan, but maybe we need one.
And also, I think one thing I would add as well is thinking about how to support people in like early stage career is super important. But I also think so much of the issues that we see and the where we really need to strive for equality, it's much more about the systematic sexism that we might see or the kind of systematic bias. So I think having all of these kind of early career stage initiatives is super important, but it really needs to be supported by initiatives that are challenging the systematic issues that we're seeing. So whether it's like the example I mentioned that's purchasing, you know, art by female artists to put in public collections, things like that, and also making sure that the people who are being hired in these really key leadership roles are not all just straight white men as well, I think is really important as well, because then it will be filtering down from every aspect and we get I guess, a shift on a much greater scale.
Yep, makes sense. Carrie, do you represent men and women?
Yes. Yeah, I'm pretty much 50-50. I'm putting together a show that opens middle of next month of photographers. And as I got to the closing bell, I realized I had tipped the bias in my favor, and I'm pretty pleased about that. But it's pretty 50-50 in the artists that I deal with at the moment, male and female.
Cool.
Sadly, though, the price point is my male artists is slightly higher than my female artists.
Mm-hmm. What time is it? Should we go to questions? Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Can't see anybody.
Hi. Thank you for this riveting discussion. I was thinking, and I think about this often when you were citing your data, you know, about the female artists and sort of their representation. You may not be able to answer this, but how much of that do you think is because they're just not women artists who aren't really getting attention or the representation they deserve, or the fact that there are, you know, potentially a lot of women who cannot continue to go to their art career because they're not supported because of choices that they make about families and structures. You know, I think about this a lot when we're talking about data. It's not just obviously limited to artists in the art world and those musicians or CEOs, but how much of that do you think is an issue, and how can we, you know, in the art world, whether it's as arts administrators or as gallerists, like help to maybe alleviate some of those pressures so that women don't have to make a choice between the two?
I think it's a really great question, and I think I'm often reluctant to focus so much around female artists and families and children. However, the reality is that overwhelmingly women are still usually the primary caregiver. So I think it's something that we can't avoid. And I've seen some really great examples of gallerists and dealers supporting their female artists through having children and fitting their careers in around that. One really good example I can think of is Pilar Correa in London. And she works with a lot of female artists, one of whom, Mary Ramsden, was heavily pregnant as she was preparing for her first kind of institutional solo show at the Museum of Aspen. And I can remember hearing her speak about being heavily pregnant. There was all this pressure on her to make this work. She makes her work when it's laying on the floor and she has to stand over it. And it was really hard for her to do this with this huge belly. But Pilar and the gallery and the support team were super supportive. You know, I'm sure it has a lot to do with the empathy that was there because it's a woman with children who was able to kind of understand what some of those challenges may have looked like. But being able to step in and offer some childcare support, or just even not put pressure on where pressure is going to not be helpful, and to kind of have some empathy with that journey, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, empathy, I think, is totally the answer. I have 2 small children, a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. And without huge buckets of empathy for my husband, my artists, the business wouldn't exist. It just wouldn't function. And boundaries to some extent. So I don't work on Fridays. Actually, and my staff too, who are amazing. So everyone makes sure Friday keeps running. I can be with my kids. I turn off my phone. And then Monday through Thursday, they've got my full attention when the kids are at school or with the nanny. But it's really, it's the artists who get it and who they know that I'm, you know, with the baby. I took 6 weeks where I said I wasn't going to check my phone, and if they needed me, they'd have to get my assistant to come to the house. And none of them did. They all waited for me to come back and be present and ready. And I think society needs to follow suit. We all need to remember that, you know, the children are our future. Without them, we're nothing. So we need to enable parents, whether the male or the female, to look after their kids in these moments that are 3 seconds long, given the span of someone's career. So the answer for me is always empathy. And
I think as well, thinking about people who are working in art spaces, not necessarily only thinking about artists, but making sure that in these art world environments, I mean in any professional space, making sure that there is support for families. And, you know, I can speak about Artsy, because that's, you know, where I work, but there is a really great parental leave policy that is offered, and I think it's really key that is a parental leave policy, so men are encouraged to take this paid leave as well, to be a support when their partners or when, you know, they're having children, however they may be having children. And then also beyond that kind of a parental leave section, but then onwards thinking about flexible working hours. You know, Artsy is really great for that. I have a lot of colleagues with children who have a couple of days where they work from home, and it really just helps with the childcare, and people are able to get their work done and they know what's expected of them, but they're able to do it on their own terms and in a way that's realistic. And I think it's smart. It makes business sense because employers will get more out of their employees and better quality work when they're really thinking about the well-being of their employees from a, you know, family perspective.
Anyone else? No? Okay, how are we on time? We're good. Wrap it up? Yeah, wrap it up. All right, so. Carrie and Gemma, thanks a ton for coming so well prepared and getting me off the hook here as a fill-in.
Except for from your wife when she realizes
she's fine. She's not going to watch this. She'll be cool with it. And thanks to the audience for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Be sure to join us for the final panel discussion of the day. It's Art in the Work Environment at 5 p.m.